Imagine this: Mateo Garcia, standing at the altar in a sun-drenched vineyard, about to wed the woman he loves, when his own parents call the cops, accuse him of being a fake son stealing millions, and try to drag him away. But the twist: he was ready with a shocking truth that changed everything.
Thanks for having me on, Eliza. Sharing this mess has been tough but empowering. I'm grateful to finally set the record straight and show how I turned betrayal into justice. Growing up as Mateo Garcia in Beverly Hills should have been a dream. Born and raised in America to Spanish immigrant grandparents who had built their fortune from nothing, our family's logistics empire was a testament to the American dream realized. My grandfather had transformed a single trucking route into a multi-million-dollar operation spanning the West Coast, providing every material comfort imaginable. The sprawling Mediterranean estate, the private schools, the summer homes, it all looked perfect from the outside. But perfection, I learned early, was just another word for prison when you were born the wrong son. My younger brother Leo, 9 years my junior, had always been the golden child. Where I was quiet and thoughtful, Leo was charismatic and bold. Where I had inherited our grandfather's distinctive green eyes, a trait that somehow made me seem foreign in my own family despite being as American as apple pie, Leo had my father's warm brown eyes and my mother's easy smile. By the time I turned 33, the pattern was clear. Leo could do no wrong and I could do no right. The family fortune was governed by an archaic will my grandfather had written in the 1960s. The controlling shares of Garcia Logistics would pass to the firstborn son upon his marriage, a tradition meant to ensure family stability and continuation of the bloodline. For years, my parents had made it clear they wished Leo had been born first. They never said it outright, but the message was delivered in 1,000 small cruelties, forgotten birthdays, excluded conversations, and the constant implication that I was somehow defective. When Leo turned 16, he received a brand new BMW wrapped in a giant red bow. When I turned 16, I got the keys to my father's old Honda Civic with a lecture about responsibility and earning my place. The message was always the same: Leo deserved the best, while I needed to prove I was worthy of scraps. When I met Chloe Martinez at a charity gala 3 years ago, I thought I had finally found someone who saw me for who I truly was. She was a pediatric nurse from East LA, the daughter of a mechanic and a teacher, and she possessed a warmth and authenticity that made my family's cold calculations seem even more repugnant. Her dark hair caught the light when she laughed, and when she looked at me with those intelligent brown eyes, I felt like I mattered for the first time in my life. My parents hated her immediately. "She's not from our world, Mijo," my mother Isabella would say, her voice dripping with disdain. "She'll never understand our responsibilities, our legacy." My father Ricardo was more direct. "You're throwing away everything your grandfather built for some gold digger who sees dollar signs when she looks at you." But Chloe wasn't interested in our money. In fact, she was horrified by my family's treatment of their employees, their tax evasion schemes, and their general attitude that wealth made them superior to everyone else. She encouraged me to think about what I wanted from life beyond the family business, and for the first time I began to imagine a future where I wasn't just the disappointing firstborn son. The engagement party they threw for us was a masterclass in passive aggression. They invited 300 people to the Beverly Hills Country Club, but introduced Chloe to everyone as Mateo's friend. Leo spent the evening charming our guests while making subtle digs about my phase of dating outside our social circle. When Chloe excused herself to the bathroom, I overheard my mother telling the wife of our biggest client that she was sure this situation would resolve itself soon. That night, as Chloe cried in my arms about feeling unwelcome in my family, I made a decision that would change everything. We would have our wedding, claim my inheritance, and then distance ourselves from the toxic environment I had grown up in. I would use my position to reform the company's practices and build something I could be proud of. Despite my usual reserve and tendency to avoid confrontation, the recent months of watching my family's cruelty had been stealing my nerves, building a resolve I didn't know I possessed. The warning signs started 3 weeks before the wedding. Leo, who had been traveling in Europe for the past 6 months, suddenly returned home with no explanation. When I asked him about it at Sunday dinner, he just shrugged and said he wanted to be here for his big brother's special day. The way he said it, with that familiar smirk playing at the corners of his mouth, made my skin crawl. My parents had initially refused to contribute anything to the wedding expenses, claiming they couldn't support a union they didn't believe in. Chloe and I had been fine with that. We preferred to pay for everything ourselves rather than give them any claim over our special day. With our budget of $50,000, we had chosen a beautiful vineyard in Sonoma County, keeping our guest list to exactly 150 close friends and family. We focused on intimate moments rather than extravagance, far enough from Beverly Hills to feel like neutral territory, but close enough that family could attend if they chose to. 2 weeks before the wedding, my mother called to say they had reconsidered and wanted to help with the arrangements. She offered to handle the floral arrangements and coordinate with the venue staff. Against my better judgment and under pressure from Chloe, who hoped this might be the beginning of a reconciliation, I agreed to let them help. That's when things got strange. I discovered my mother had been calling the venue multiple times a day, asking detailed questions about the layout, the timing of the ceremony, and the credentials required for the officiant. When I called to check on the flowers, the coordinator mentioned that Mrs. Garcia had been very specific about wanting 2 identical boutonnieres for the groomsmen, even though I had told her we were only having one best man. She said there might be a last-minute addition to the wedding party, the coordinator explained. Something about family tradition. I hadn't mentioned any family tradition, and Leah wasn't in the wedding party. When I confronted my mother about it, she waved me off dismissively. I just want everything to be perfect, Mijo. You never know when plans might change. The second red flag came when I ran into our family lawyer, Mr. Hendricks, at a coffee shop downtown. He looked uncomfortable when he saw me, almost guilty. Mateo, good to see you, he said, but his eyes were darting around like he was looking for an escape route. Big day coming up, huh? Yes, sir, we're excited. He nodded slowly, then leaned in closer. Your parents have been asking a lot of questions about your grandfather's will lately, specifically about the verification requirements for the inheritance clause. My blood ran cold. What kind of verification requirements? Well, the will states that the inheritance passes to the firstborn son upon marriage, but it also includes a clause about confirming identity in cases of dispute. Your grandfather was paranoid about fraud, you know. He required multiple forms of identification and witness testimony. Has anyone disputed my identity? Mr. Hendricks shifted uncomfortably. Not officially, but your mother has been asking hypothetical questions about what would happen if someone claimed the heir was an imposter. She wanted to know what kind of evidence would be required to prove or disprove such a claim. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to Chloe, listening to her peaceful breathing and trying to make sense of what my parents might be planning. The pieces were there: Leo's sudden return, the identical boutonnieres, the questions about identity verification. But the picture they formed was so insane that I couldn't quite believe it. Were they actually planning to have me removed from my own wedding and replaced with Leo? The more I thought about it, the more plausible it seemed. Leo and I were roughly the same height and build. With my brown hair styled in its classic side part and in matching tuxedos, from a distance, we might look similar enough to fool an officiant who had only met me briefly. If they could create enough chaos and confusion, if they could convince people that I was somehow an imposter trying to steal the family fortune. But that would be insane. Even for my parents, that would be crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The third warning sign came 5 days before the wedding, when I discovered that my parents had hired private security for the event. When I called the security company to ask about it, they told me the contract specified protection against potential wedding crashers and fraudulent individuals attempting to disrupt the ceremony. I hadn't asked for security. Chloe and I had specifically chosen a small, intimate venue precisely because we didn't want the kind of formal, heavily secured affair my parents preferred. When I confronted my father about it, he claimed it was just a precaution. You're about to become a very wealthy man, Mateo. That makes you a target. We just want to make sure nothing goes wrong on your special day. The way he said your special day made it sound like he was talking about someone else's funeral. The final piece fell into place when I overheard a phone conversation between my parents 2 nights before the wedding. I had come by the house to pick up some family photos Chloe wanted for the reception tables, and I heard voices coming from my father's study. The door was slightly ajar, and I caught fragments of conversation that made my blood freeze. Have the officers positioned near the altar. Leo needs to be ready to step in immediately. Make sure the disruption happens before any legal documents are signed. I pressed closer to the door, my heart hammering in my chest. If this works, Leo inherits everything and that woman is out of our lives forever. That was my mother's voice, cold and calculating in a way that made me feel sick. Just need to create enough doubt about his identity. The identical tuxedos will help with the confusion. I backed away from the door slowly, my mind reeling. They were actually going to do it. They were going to try to have me arrested at my own wedding as an imposter, create enough chaos and doubt that they could somehow install Leo in my place. The audacity of it was breathtaking, but so was the cruelty. They were willing to destroy my wedding day, humiliate me in front of everyone I cared about, and steal my inheritance, all to cover up whatever secret they were hiding about Leo's preferential treatment. That weekend, unable to shake my growing paranoia but determined to be prepared for whatever they were planning, I decided to do something that felt both crazy and absolutely necessary. I drove to a private laboratory in downtown LA and requested a paternity test. The technician, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked surprised when I explained what I wanted. You want to test your own paternity? She asked. May I ask why? I gave her the short version: family disputes about inheritance, questions about identity verification. She nodded sympathetically and explained the process, including the crucial chain of custody procedures that would make the results legally admissible. I would need a DNA sample from myself and from my father. Getting my own sample was easy enough, but getting one from my father would require some creativity. The opportunity came 2 days later at our final family dinner before the wedding. My parents had insisted on hosting one last meal together to clear the air and start fresh. I arrived early and helped my mother set the table, palming one of the water glasses my father always used, the heavy crystal ones with his initials engraved on the bottom. During dinner, the conversation was stilted and uncomfortable. Leo kept making jokes about how different our lives would be after the wedding, while my parents asked pointed questions about our honeymoon plans and where we intended to live. When my father excused himself to take a phone call, I quickly wrapped his used glass in a napkin and slipped it into my jacket pocket, following the lab technician's instructions for proper sample handling to ensure chain of custody. 3 days later, I had the results. The test confirmed what I had never doubted. I was indeed Ricardo Garcia's biological son. But something about the process had awakened a deeper suspicion, a nagging doubt that had been growing in the back of my mind for years. Leo and I looked nothing alike. Where I had inherited our grandfather's green eyes and angular features, Leo had softer features, different bone structure, and those warm brown eyes that everyone always commented on. Growing up, people often remarked that Leo looked exactly like our mother, while I was said to favor our grandfather's side of the family. But what if there was more to it than that? I thought about my mother's affair when I was 12. It had been brief, supposedly, and my parents had worked through it in counseling. But the timing, Leo would have been 9 then, already born, so that couldn't be connected, unless there had been other affairs, earlier ones. The doubt gnawed at me until I couldn't stand it anymore. I called the lab back and asked about testing siblings. The technician explained that they could determine if 2 people shared the same biological father by comparing their DNA profiles. All I needed was a sample from Leo. Getting that sample proved easier than I'd expected. At the rehearsal dinner, Leo was drinking heavily and being his usual careless self. When he went to the bathroom, leaving his beer bottle on the table, I saw my chance. I wrapped the bottle in a napkin and added it to the collection I was building, again following proper handling procedures. The results came back the morning of my wedding, delivered to my email at 6 a.m. as I was getting ready in my hotel room. I opened the message with shaking hands, not sure what I was hoping to find. The report was clear and devastating. Leo and I did not share a biological father. The morning of my wedding dawned clear and beautiful, with that perfect California sunshine that makes everything look like it belongs in a movie. The vineyard was stunning, rolling hills covered in neat rows of grapevines, with the ceremony site nestled in a grove of ancient oak trees that Chloe and I had fallen in love with during our first visit. We had dreamed of this vineyard wedding for months, seeing it as the perfect symbol of our fresh start away from my family's toxicity. White roses and baby's breath lined the aisle, and the altar was framed by an arch of greenery that looked like something out of a fairy tale. I stood in the bridal suite's mirror, adjusting my bow tie for the 10th time. My brown hair was perfectly styled in my usual side part, and the black tuxedo fit like it had been made for me, which it had. At 33, I felt like I was finally stepping into the life I was meant to live. In a few hours, Chloe and I would be married. I would officially inherit my grandfather's company, and we could begin building something beautiful together. The DNA results were safely tucked in my jacket pocket, my insurance policy against whatever my parents had planned. My best man Marcus knocked on the door and entered with a huge grin on his face. We'd been friends since college, and he was one of the few people who truly understood what this day meant to me. "You ready for this, man?" he asked, straightening his own tie in the mirror beside me. "More than ready," I replied, and I meant it. Despite all the family drama, despite the weird behavior from my parents over the past few weeks, I felt calm and confident. Whatever they were planning, I was prepared for it. We made our way to the ceremony site, where our carefully curated guest list of 150 people was already taking their seats. The intimate gathering included mostly Chloe's family and our mutual friends, people who had chosen to support us despite my parents' disapproval. As I took my position at the altar, I scanned the crowd and immediately spotted my family. My parents sat in the front row, dressed formally but wearing expressions that seemed more appropriate for a funeral than a wedding. Leo sat beside them, and my heart skipped a beat when I saw what he was wearing, an identical tuxedo. Down to the same bow tie, the same cufflinks, even the same boutonniere. From where I stood, we probably looked like twins. I caught Marcus's eye and nodded toward Leo. Marcus followed my gaze and his eyebrows shot up. "What the hell is that about?" he whispered. "I have no idea," I lied, because I was starting to have a very clear idea and it was making my stomach churn. The string quartet began playing the processional music, and I forced myself to focus on the moment I'd been waiting for. Chloe's bridesmaids walked down the aisle, her sister Maria, her best friend from nursing school, and her cousin Alina, each carrying small bouquets of white roses. They looked beautiful, but I barely saw them. I was waiting for Chloe. Then the music changed to the wedding march, and there she was. Chloe looked like an angel walking toward me. Her dress was simple but elegant, a flowing A-line gown with delicate lace sleeves and a train that seemed to float behind her. Her dark hair was pulled back in an elegant updo with small white flowers woven throughout, and her smile was so radiant it made my chest tight with emotion. She was walking alone, having chosen not to be given away by anyone. "I'm giving myself to you," she had told me during our planning. "That's how it should be." As she approached the altar, I felt tears prick at my eyes. This woman had chosen me, had seen past my family's wealth and dysfunction to the man I really was. In a few minutes, she would be my wife, and we could start building a life together based on love instead of obligation. That's when my mother's voice shattered the perfect moment like a sledgehammer through crystal. Stop the wedding." The music screeched to a halt. Every head in the venue turned toward the front row, where my mother Isabella had risen to her feet, her face contorted with what looked like genuine panic. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rustle of wedding dresses and the confused murmur of 150 wedding guests who weren't sure if this was some kind of elaborate joke or a genuine crisis. "That's not my son," she screamed, pointing directly at me with a trembling finger. "That man is an imposter." Chloe had stopped halfway down the aisle, her bouquet trembling in her hands as she stared at my mother in shock. I could see the confusion and hurt in her eyes. The way this moment she had dreamed of was being destroyed by people who had never wanted her to be part of our family. My father Ricardo stood up beside my mother, his face grave and authoritative. At 65, he still commanded respect in business circles, and his voice carried the weight of decades of successful negotiations when he spoke. "I'm sorry to disrupt this ceremony," he announced, his voice projecting across the vineyard with practiced authority, "but we cannot allow this fraud to continue. This man is not our son Mateo. We don't know who he is or what his intentions are, but he is attempting to steal our family's inheritance through deception." A ripple of shocked murmurs ran through the crowd. I could see phones being pulled out, cameras being raised. In the age of social media, my family was creating a scene that would be talked about for years, and they were doing it deliberately. Someone in the back was already live streaming, turning my wedding into an instant viral sensation. Leo rose from his seat, and I watched in horrified fascination as he began walking toward the altar. The identical tuxedo made the whole thing feel surreal, like I was watching some kind of twisted mirror version of my own wedding. His movements were confident, rehearsed, like he had practiced this moment. "I'm sorry everyone," Leo said, his voice carrying just the right note of embarrassed apology mixed with righteous indignation. "This is obviously a very difficult situation for our family. This man has been impersonating my brother for months, and we had hoped to resolve this privately, but..." He spread his hands in a gesture of helpless regret, as if he were the victim of circumstances beyond his control. The performance was flawless, and I could see it working on the crowd. "We couldn't let him go through with this charade. The real Mateo Garcia is standing right here." He gestured to himself with false modesty. "I know this is confusing, but we can provide documentation to prove who is who." The crowd was eating it up. I could see the doubt creeping into people's faces, the way they were looking back and forth between Leo and me, trying to figure out which one of us was telling the truth. From a distance in matching tuxedos, we probably did look similar enough to create reasonable doubt. Phones were recording every word, capturing every moment of this spectacular family implosion. Chloe finally found her voice. "This is insane," she called out, her voice shaking with anger and disbelief. "Mateo, what is happening?" Before I could answer, my mother let out another dramatic wail, her hand pressed to her forehead like a Victorian heroine. "We've been trying to handle this quietly, but he's been threatening us. He knows details about our family because he's been stalking us, studying us. We think he might be dangerous." That was the signal. As if they had been waiting in the wings, which they probably had, two uniformed police officers appeared from behind the catering tent. They walked toward the altar with the measured pace of professionals responding to domestic disturbance, their presence adding an official weight to my parents' accusations. The lead officer, a middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes, approached me carefully. His name tag read Miller. "Sir, I'm Officer Miller with the Sonoma County Sheriff's Department. We've received a report about a possible identity theft situation. I'm going to need to ask you some questions." My heart was pounding, but my mind was crystal clear. This was the moment I had been preparing for, even though I hadn't fully realized it until now. All those nagging doubts, all those suspicious coincidences, they had led to this confrontation. "Of course, officer," I said, my voice steady despite the chaos around me. "I'm happy to cooperate." My mother's voice rose again, shrill with manufactured hysteria. "He won't have proper identification. That's how we know he's a fraud. He's been using fake documents." Officer Miller nodded and turned back to me. "Sir, I'm going to need to see some identification. Driver's license, passport, anything that can verify your identity." This was it. The moment my parents had orchestrated, the trap they thought would spring perfectly. They expected me to fumble for my wallet, to produce documents they could claim were forged, to create enough confusion that their version of events would seem plausible. Instead, I smiled. "Officer, my family has been questioning my identity for some time now," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent vineyard. Given the substantial inheritance at stake, I thought it would be wise to obtain something more definitive than a driver's license. I reached into the inner pocket of my tuxedo jacket and pulled out the sealed plastic envelope containing the DNA test results. The document was crisp and official, bearing the letterhead of one of Los Angeles' most respected genetic testing laboratories. "This is a certified DNA paternity test," I announced, handing the document to Officer Miller. "It confirms with 99.99% certainty that I am the biological son of Ricardo Garcia." The crowd leaned forward, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Officer Miller unfolded the document, his eyebrows rising as he scanned the official letterhead and technical details. The silence stretched out like a held breath as he read through the results. When he looked up, his expression had shifted from professional skepticism to something approaching amazement. "This appears to be legitimate," he said, holding up the document so the crowd could see the official seal. "It's from GeneTech Labs, dated 3 days ago, and it clearly states that the subject," he looked at me, "shares DNA markers consistent with being the biological son of Ricardo Garcia." My mother's face had gone pale, but she wasn't giving up yet. Those tests can be faked. Anyone can get false documents made. This proves nothing. Actually, ma'am, Officer Miller replied, DNA tests from accredited laboratories are extremely difficult to falsify. The chain of custody procedures and verification protocols make fraud nearly impossible. But I wasn't finished. The first document had been my opening move, designed to establish my legitimacy beyond any doubt. Now it was time for the killing blow. Officer, there's something else you should know, I said, reaching into my other jacket pocket. When my family began questioning my identity, I became curious about something that had bothered me for years. I pulled out the second DNA report, this one comparing Leo's genetic profile to our father's. The crowd leaned forward even more, phones recording every moment, some guests already posting to social media with captions like, "This is going viral and you won't believe what's happening at this wedding. You see, my brother and I have never looked much alike." People always commented on it, so when I was having my own paternity confirmed, I decided to test his as well. Leo's face went from smug confidence to dawning horror in the space of a heartbeat. My father, who had been standing rigid with authority, suddenly looked like a man who had seen his own ghost. And what I discovered, I continued, unfolding the second report with deliberate ceremony, is that while I am indeed my father's biological son, Leo is not. The gasp that went up from the crowd was audible even over the wind rustling through the oak trees. My mother let out a strangled cry and sank back into her chair as if her legs had given out. My father's face went from pale to ghostly white, his eyes darting between the report in my hands and my mother's horrified expression. Officer Miller took the second report and read it carefully, his professional composure slipping slightly as he processed the implications. The transformation in the crowd was remarkable to witness. What had started as confusion and doubt had shifted to fascination, and now was settling into something like righteous satisfaction. This test indicates that Leo Garcia and Ricardo Garcia do not share a biological father-son relationship, he announced to the crowd, his voice carrying across the vineyard like a verdict. That's impossible. Leo finally found his voice, but it came out as a squeak. This is all fake. He's manipulating the evidence. Both tests were conducted by the same laboratory using proper chain of custody procedures, I replied calmly, my voice growing stronger with each word. The samples were collected independently and processed using standard protocols. There's no possibility of manipulation. I turned to address the crowd directly, my voice carrying the confidence of a man who had finally found his truth. Phones were still recording, capturing every word for posterity and social media. For 33 years, my parents have treated me like an outsider in my own family. They've questioned my loyalty, my legitimacy, my right to inherit what my grandfather built. They've made me feel like I didn't belong, like I was somehow defective or wrong. My voice grew stronger as I continued, years of suppressed pain and anger finally finding their outlet. And all along, it was their precious golden child who was the product of an affair. Leo isn't a Garcia. He has no claim to our family's legacy, no right to our inheritance. He's been living a lie his entire life, and my parents have been perpetuating that lie while making me suffer for it. The crowd was riveted, completely invested in this real-life drama unfolding before their eyes. This wasn't just a wedding anymore, it was a public reckoning decades in the making, and they were witnessing it firsthand. My father finally found his voice, but it came out as a broken whisper. "Isabella, is this true?" My mother's face crumpled and she began to sob. Not the manufactured tears she had been using to create drama, but real devastating sobs of a woman whose deepest secret had just been exposed in front of 150 people. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry, Ricardo. It was so long ago, and I thought if we just never talked about it." "How long have you known?" my father demanded, his voice growing stronger with anger and betrayal. "Since he was born," she admitted through her tears. "The time. I knew he couldn't be yours, but you were so happy, and he looked enough like me that I thought maybe." The confession hung in the air like a toxic cloud. 24 years of lies, of favoritism, of making me feel like the problem, all to cover up my mother's betrayal and protect a son who wasn't even part of our bloodline. Officer Miller cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding around him, but recognizing the gravity of what had just been revealed. "Sir," he said to me, "it appears you are exactly who you claim to be. As for the disruption of your wedding," he turned to my parents with a stern expression that suggested he was not amused by their theatrics. "Filing a false police report is a serious offense. Causing a public disturbance is also against the law." Officer Miller's partner, a younger woman with sharp eyes who had been taking notes throughout the confrontation, stepped forward now, her voice official and unyielding. "Mr. and Mrs. Garcia, you're going to need to come with us. Filing a false police report is a misdemeanor offense, and causing a public disturbance at a private event could result in additional charges." "This is ridiculous," my mother protested, but her voice lacked conviction. She looked like a woman who had just watched her entire world collapse in real time. "We're prominent members of the community. You can't arrest us at our son's wedding." "Ma'am, this isn't your son's wedding," the female officer replied with perfect deadpan delivery that drew audible chuckles from the crowd. "According to the DNA evidence, your son isn't getting married today. This gentleman is." She gestured toward me. Leo made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation, his voice cracking with desperation. "Wait, this is all a misunderstanding. Maybe the tests are wrong, or maybe there's another explanation. The explanation is that your mother had an affair 24 years ago and you're the result, I said, my voice cutting through his babbling like a knife. There's no other interpretation of these results, Leo. You're not my father's son, which means you're not a Garcia, which means you have no claim to anything our grandfather built. As the police car pulled away with my parents in the back seat, and Leo disappeared into the parking lot looking lost and broken, I turned to face the crowd of wedding guests who had just witnessed the most dramatic family implosion in recent memory. The silence was complete, broken only by the sound of wind through the oak trees and the distant hum of traffic on the highway. Then, slowly, someone started to clap. It was Chloe's father, Miguel, a man who had worked with his hands his entire life and had no patience for the kind of privileged nonsense my family specialized in. His applause was joined by others, first Chloe's family, then our friends, and finally nearly the entire crowd was on their feet, giving me an ovation that felt like vindication and liberation rolled into one. But I only had eyes for Chloe. She stood where she had stopped in the aisle, still holding her bouquet, her wedding dress pristine despite the chaos that had erupted around her. Her face was streaked with tears, but she was smiling. Not the polite smile of someone trying to salvage a difficult situation, but the radiant, genuine smile of a woman who had just watched the man she loved stand up for himself in the most spectacular way possible. "I'm sorry," I said, walking toward her through the aisle lined with white roses and baby's breath. "This isn't how I wanted our wedding day to go." She shook her head, her smile growing even brighter. "Are you kidding me? This is exactly how I wanted it to go. Really, Mateo, I've watched your family treat you like garbage for 3 years. I've seen how they made you doubt yourself, how they made you feel like you weren't good enough. And today I got to watch you stand up to them with actual scientific evidence that proved they were wrong about everything." She reached up and touched my face, her fingers gentle against my cheek. I fell in love with a man who was kind and thoughtful and strong, even when his own family couldn't see those qualities. Today, everyone else got to see what I've always known, that you're exactly the man you're supposed to be. The efficient Dr. Sarah Chen, a middle-aged woman who had been standing frozen at the altar throughout the entire confrontation, finally found her voice. Her expression was a mixture of professional composure and barely contained amazement. "Well," she said, her tone dry but amused, "in 30 years of performing wedding ceremonies, I have to say this is a first. Should we continue with the wedding, or would you prefer to reschedule?" I looked around at the crowd of people who had just witnessed my family's spectacular self-destruction. These were the people who mattered: Chloe's family, our friends, the colleagues who had chosen to support us despite my parents' disapproval. They had seen me at my most vulnerable and my most triumphant, and they were still here. Many were still recording on their phones, documenting this moment that would undoubtedly become legendary. "I think," I said, taking Chloe's hand and leading her toward the altar, "that we've kept our guests waiting long enough." The ceremony that followed was unlike anything I had ever imagined. There was an electricity in the air, a sense that we were witnessing something historic. When Dr. Chen asked if anyone objected to the union, a ripple of laughter went through the crowd. After what had just happened, it seemed impossible that anyone could top my parents' objection. When it came time for the vows, I set aside the carefully crafted words I had prepared and spoke from the heart, my voice carrying clearly across the vineyard. "Chloe, 3 years ago you saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. You loved me when I felt unlovable, believed in me when I doubted everything about who I was. Today, in front of all these people, I learned the truth about my family, about the lies that shaped my childhood, about the reasons I always felt like an outsider." I paused, looking into her eyes, seeing my future reflected there. But I also learned something else. I learned that family isn't just about DNA. It's about the people who choose to love you, who stand by you when the world gets crazy, who see your worth even when you can't see it yourself. You are my family, Chloe. You and everyone here who chose to stay and celebrate with us after watching my world turn upside down. 6 months later, I sat in the conference room of Hendricks, Morrison & Associates, the law firm that had handled my family's affairs for 3 generations. The mahogany table was covered with documents, contracts, and legal briefs that represented the transfer of Garcia Logistics from my grandfather's estate to me. At 33, I was now the majority shareholder and CEO of a company worth over $50 million. Mr. Hendricks, the same lawyer who had warned me about my parents' suspicious questions, looked both relieved and slightly amazed as he pushed the final signature page across the table. "Congratulations, Mr. Garcia," he said. "You are now the official heir to your grandfather's legacy." The inheritance had been challenged, of course. My parents had hired their own legal team to contest the DNA evidence, claiming the tests had been falsified or that the will's language was ambiguous. But genetic science is remarkably difficult to argue with, and my grandfather's will was crystal clear. The inheritance went to the firstborn biological son upon his marriage. Leo had tried to claim that he should still be considered part of the family, but legally he had no standing. Without a biological connection to my grandfather, he was essentially a stranger who had been living in our house for 24 years. The criminal charges against my parents had been resolved with plea bargains, community service and fines for filing false police reports and disturbing the peace. The real punishment had been the public humiliation and the complete destruction of their social standing in Beverly Hills. The video of my wedding confrontation had gone viral, racking up millions of views and turning them into a cautionary tale about the dangers of privilege and deception. My mother had tried to contact me several times, sending long letters filled with apologies and explanations. She claimed she had been young and scared when she had the affair, that she had convinced herself Leo might actually be my father's son, that the favoritism had been her way of overcompensating for her guilt. I had read the letters, but I hadn't responded. Some betrayals are too fundamental to forgive, and some lies too damaging to overlook. My father had been more direct. He had shown up at my office one day, looking older and more broken than I had ever seen him. He had apologized for the years of treating me like a disappointment, for allowing my mother's deception to poison his relationship with his real son. He had asked if there was any way we could rebuild, if I could find it in my heart to forgive an old man's mistakes. I had listened to everything he had to say, and then I had told him the truth. I didn't know if forgiveness was possible, but I was willing to try. We had started meeting for coffee once a month, awkward conversations where we tried to figure out how to be father and son after decades of being strangers. It was slow progress, but it was progress. Leo had disappeared entirely. Last I heard, he was living in Arizona, working at a car dealership and trying to figure out who he was when he wasn't the golden child of a wealthy family. Part of me wondered if I should reach out to him, offer some kind of olive branch, but I wasn't ready for that yet. Maybe someday. As I signed the final documents transferring control of Garcia Logistics to me, I thought about my grandfather, the man whose green eyes I had inherited along with his business empire. He had built something lasting, something that would survive the petty cruelties and deceptions of the generation that came after him. I intended to honor that legacy, but I was going to do it my way. The first thing I did as CEO was implement the worker protection and benefits programs that Chloe had suggested, the ones my parents had always dismissed as too expensive or unnecessary. The second thing I did was establish a scholarship fund for the children of our employees, ensuring that the next generation would have opportunities regardless of their parents' economic status. The third thing I did was change the company's hiring practices to prioritize merit over connections, competence over privilege. Garcia Logistics was going to be a place where people were valued for what they contributed, not who their parents were. Chloe and I had bought a house in Santa Monica, close enough to the office for my commute but far enough from Beverly Hills to feel like neutral territory. We were talking about starting a family, about raising children who would know they were loved unconditionally, who would never have to wonder if they belonged. As I walked out of the law office that day, the final paperwork complete, I felt something I had never experienced before. The absolute certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, exactly who I was supposed to be. My phone buzzed with a text from Chloe. "How did it go, Mr. CEO?" I smiled as I typed back, "Perfect, ready to change the world." Her response came immediately, "With you, always." I looked up at the California sky, clear and blue and full of possibility, and started walking toward my car. I had a company to run, a wife to love, and a future to build. And for the first time in my life, I knew exactly who I was and where I belonged. The truth, as it turned out, really had set me free.
Mateo, thank you for bravely sharing your story. It reveals how confronting deep-rooted family lies with hard evidence can reclaim your identity and redefine what family means. Your experience reminds us that truth, though painful, can dismantle toxic secrets and foster real connections. I'm Eliza Quinn, and remember, here on Wedding Day Justice, veils off, justice on.